after gunfire damaged 2 substations.
Substations in Washington and Oregon have also been attacked in recent weeks, and now the FBI is involved.
Growing online chatter from domestic extremist groups is celebrating the recent attack.
This attack on the power station was done in order to prevent a drag show from taking place.
That a drag show in the area was what motivated these perpetrators to intentionally vandalize the electric substations in the area.
Some men just want to watch the world burn.
By now, it's no secret that the United States has seen a rash of attacks on its power grid. Before we examine that in depth, there's some things I need to say first, so bear with me. I do have a point.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them.
In the minds of most, war isn't an abstract concept. War is a kinetic or physical confrontation between two nations or states. War is a grand struggle on some far-flung bloody battlefield, where young men are cut down before their time in a grand contest of arms for their God and country. But that's simply a piece of a much larger picture. Even the lowest of us armchair generals can quote the famous dictum of Karl von Clausewitz, where he states that war is merely the continuation of political policy by other means. That is to say, war isn't some blunt political instrument. It is politics. War is how you go about enforcing and imposing your will on another group when diplomatic methods have failed. And it's with this understanding of war in mind that we need to critically examine the political happenings in the West. Sorry, Fallout gamers, the idea that
War never changes.
is asinine. War is constantly changing. It's in a state of flux all the time. Failure to recognize the ever-changing circumstances of war and politics and adapt to them spells certain death every time. It's just like this scene in Indiana Jones. You can be as skilled as you want at the old way of doing things, but nobody is going to come along and pit their weakness against your strength for the sake of honorable combat.
Look, are you just fiddling around with me or what?
I just want you to feel you're doing well.
Much like Indiana Jones, they're going to fight you asymmetrically. They're going to pit their strength against your weakness. And I'd like you to keep this in mind as we examine these attacks, because these attacks are a perfect microcosm of the next war. These attacks, they're a petri dish of fourth generation warfare. Now, I've mentioned the term fourth generation warfare a couple of times now, so it's worth exploring briefly what the first 3 generations of warfare were first before we touch on that. And bear in mind that there wasn't a perfect transition from generation to generation. At points in history, different generations of warfare coexisted, they blended into one another, and just because you've entered a new generation of warfare doesn't mean that some characteristics and tactics of the preceding generation aren't still present and relevant. This 4-generation warfare model comes from a man by the name of William Lind. For those of you interested in maneuver warfare, asymmetric warfare, and the idea of 4th generation warfare, I'll post some of his stuff in the description of this video. So when William Lind talks about the generations of warfare, he's talking about the generations of modern warfare. So this starts with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ending the 30 Years' War. The Peace of Westphalia is significant because it effectively gives the modern state our conception of that entity that is a modern country, a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Now only the state could wage war as opposed to business enterprises and criminal organizations and the like, and anybody else was hanged from the nearest tree. The first generation of this new modern warfare was what we today would commonly understand as Napoleonic tactics, or tactics of line and column, close order battle. Soldiers would mass together and advance slowly over open ground, with rigid discipline becoming a defining characteristic of this type of warfare. second generation of warfare came to prominence during World War I. This generation of warfare is often referred to as methodical battle. It's characterized by tactics of linear fire and movement with a heavy reliance on indirect fire. The general concept was that in order to break the stalemate, you would hammer enemy positions with indirect fire, sometimes for days, and time the bombardments in such a way that you can advance over open ground under the cover of artillery fire. The third generation of warfare came to being at the tail end of World War I, but started in earnest in World War II. Though not quite synonymous, it's helpful when envisioning third generation warfare to picture the concept of German blitzkrieg. Simply put, this is the tactic of infiltration to bypass and collapse the enemy's combat forces. This is where we start to get the concepts of maneuver warfare and the deep battle and things like that. When most people think of a World War III or a modern-day peer-to-peer conflict, this is typically what they're thinking of.
Good God, look at that! Where you going, General?
Berlin! I'm gonna personally shoot that paper-hanging son of a bitch!
So what then is fourth-generation warfare? Now, the phenomenon of fourth-generation warfare is tied very closely to the crisis of legitimacy faced by the modern Western state. I made a video touching on this briefly, I'll link it in the description. Fourth-generation warfare represents, in part, a regression to the pre-Westphalian order. That is to say, that the state, as it's losing its legitimacy, is losing its monopoly on the legitimate use of force. As states fail to represent the interests of their people, and as multicultural empires are imploding, a plurality, if not a majority of people are shifting their primary allegiance from that nation state to some other group which they feel represents their defining characteristic. Whether that's religion, whether that's race, doesn't necessarily matter. These people who feel disenfranchised by their own governments will form organizations that they feel do represent their interests. Now, these organizations don't always start with violent intent. But generally speaking, as a state declines, these organizations will become violent non-state actors or guerrillas fighting that state. When these conflicts do go kinetic, they're complex and long-term. The conflict is low intensity with the traditional state fighting these highly decentralized guerrilla forces who embed themselves among non-combatants. These violent non-state actors, if we were to map their resources next to that of traditional state actors on a graph, it wouldn't even register. Yet the world's premier military power, the United States, is somehow 0-3 against violent non-state actors. These illiterate goat herders wearing bathrobes, wearing flip-flops, and wielding rusty AKs. As nations become nothing more than an economic zone with arbitrarily drawn boundaries, these competing non-state actors are waging war to win your allegiance. Remember, war is politics, and politics is war. The greatest victories are won without firing a shot, and the United States has been subverted and conquered without a drop of bloodshed. The primary method through which they've done this, the primary battlefield, has been a decades-long propaganda campaign waged on both traditional and alternative media. Every TV show or movie you watch, it's propaganda. Every news story you see, it's propaganda. Every anti-white tweet or hateful TikTok or retarded Reddit post, every time some shithead calls you Nazi, even though that term is just newspeak for really bad person and they couldn't even articulate to you what a Nazi actually is, or shitlib YouTube video, it's akin to a military operation. Carefully curated and promoted propaganda is being used in order to demonize, vilify, and suppress the voices of the political opponents of the powers that be. all while trying to win the war in the minds of the people. And they've done a fantastic job. We, the dissident right, stand at a very precarious position.
Uh-oh.
Don't tell me. We're about to go over a huge waterfowl.
Yep.
Sharp rocks at the bottom?
Most likely.
Bring it on.
We'll discuss this a little more at the end of the video, but for now, we've discussed fourth generation warfare to the point where we can analyze the recent power grid attacks in the United States.
This is where the fun begins.
So, what do we know for sure? Well, not much. We know for certain that 2 Duke Energy substations in Moore County, North Carolina, were attacked. Somebody shot at critical pieces of the equipment and knocked out power to 45,000 people. We know that a few weeks before that and a few weeks after that, there were attacks or acts of vandalism on critical power infrastructure in Washington and Oregon. Who done it is a $75,000 question that the FBI still doesn't have an answer to. True to form, however, anti-white elements are already leaping on the opportunity to pin an act of terrorism on evil white neon Yahtzees.
You should make a very convincing Nazi.
And what evidence do they have to substantiate these claims? Well, apparently the Department of Homeland Security has access to a super secret neo-Nazi Telegram channel where they're encouraging and applauding acts of violence and terrorism like this. The FBI themselves say this constitutes a specific, incredible threat to American infrastructure. Also, there was a drag show in town that those bigots just wanted to stop. And... Oh, wait. That's it. No one's taken responsibility. No further public information at the time of this recording has been released. They're operating off of those 2 pieces of evidence. Unless, of course, you count the fact that the FBI caught 3 quote-unquote white supremacists in a sting operation roughly a year ago, but we'll touch on that in a second. Let's put our tinfoil caps on for a second and do some conspiratorial thinking.
We're breaking the conditioning! Ah!
Okay, so let's talk about the super secret neo-Nazi Telegram posts. First of all, the idea that mainstream media outlets and the fucking FBI are grasping at straws so hard to try and pin this on Whitey that some of their best evidence is a 4chan tier Telegram shitpost, likely created or infiltrated by federal agents, mind you, is comical to me. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that such Telegram posts exist, and I've seen probably what they're talking about posted on 4chan from time to time. But let's talk about a couple of issues with this line of reasoning. Number one, I can't find any actual citation of that post they're referencing. It's just cited by mainstream media outlets and even an academic journal with 0 substantiation, which is a problem. Secondly, the idea that you believe an online shitpost is some sort of credible threat is just laughable to me. Like, if this is the standard of evidence, then literally every time a black person robs or murders or rapes a white person, which is a lot, it should be considered an act of domestic terror, because I see nothing but anti-white posts all the time on every social media platform.
Kill Whitey!
Now let's talk about the fact that there was a drag show in town, and supposedly this is a smoking gun. Here's your motive. Here's why they attacked the power grids. They wanted to stop a drag show. They'll then cite the fact that there were protests outside of drag shows involving children across the country, which, as an aside, super based.
It's a trap! You shall not pass!
Do not let these kitty-diddling degenerates around children unopposed. Now, I want to make myself clear. I do not support, nor am I encouraging any sort of violence. Quite the contrary, morality of violence aside, it's just not pragmatic, and we'll touch on that later. But I digress. It would seem to me that the fact that this attack occurred when there was some sort of drag show going on is mere coincidence. There doesn't seem to be any concrete, reliable data as to how many drag shows go on every year. However, according to a report by the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, and how come every group on the face of the planet gets an anti-defamation league but white people? But again, I digress. According to their report, every 2.5 days, or 38% of this year, there have been attacks on drag performances and shows across the United States. Now, I'm highly skeptical of that, and somebody probably should dig into that, but I can't be bothered, truth be known. And it's outside the scope of this video anyhow. But if we take these people at their word, even if we assume that every single drag show that happens gets attacked, that means there's at least one drag show somewhere in the United States every 2.5 days. And it stands to reason that only a small percentage of the drag shows that happen ever get attacked. So, again, full disclosure, I've got no hard data to back this number up, but using my rudimentary reasoning skills, we can figure there's at least one drag show a day in the United States. Point being, drag shows aren't an isolated enough occurrence for someone to definitively say that that correlation between the drag show and the attack equals causation. And nobody has even made mention of the other alternatives, right? Like, we know the Chinese and the Russians have been engaged in a multi-decade-long cyber war against the United States. We know that their MO is, in part, to target critical infrastructure. We know these psychopaths in NATO have done nothing but try to antagonize the Russians and the Chinese. But nobody wants to bring up the fact that it could have been one of our foreign adversaries, especially when we're engaged in a proxy war with one of them. I mean, if the standard of evidence for publications these days is just half-baked conjecture, why not mention the possibility that it was Russian commandos or Chinese commandos? Maybe they got sick of the fuck games the United States has been playing on the global stage and wanted to remind them that they're still capable adversaries. Especially when our southern border is virtually unsecured and we have thousands upon thousands of people who are not getting vetted at all crossing into the United States weekly, if not daily. It would be child's play for professional operators to get into the United States and carry out an attack like this. But then again, wouldn't you know it? Our intelligence agencies are really good. I mean, this is bordering on clairvoyant. On November 30th, 2022, just days before this attack, the Department of Homeland Security released a National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin, wherein they talk about the likelihood of attacks on, drumroll please, LGBTQI plus community, and U.S. critical infrastructure. I mean, this has really made me reevaluate my opinion of the intelligence community. I mean, sure, historically, our intelligence community has been terrible at predicting anything. I mean, yeah, they missed 400,000 screaming Chinamen crossing a bridge 10 meters wide in Korea after the Chinese government told us they were going to do so. Boy, they sure took an L predicting and stopping 9/11 or finding those WMDs in Iraq, but man, they were on their A game for this one. This really makes me do a big think. Well, I know I for one trust them implicitly now. But sarcasm aside, let's take a look at another piece of evidence conjured up by talking heads and people on social media, which is being used to blame evil white supremacists for these attacks. And that's the fact that, as I alluded to earlier, roughly a year ago, 3 self-described white supremacists were caught in a plot to attack critical infrastructure here in the United States. Now, how do we know they were evil white supremacists? Well, stroke of luck actually. The FBI affidavit regarding this case, which was supposed to be sealed, was accidentally released.
Coincidence? I think not!
And they don't openly admit to this being a sting operation, but it really smacks of one. I'm not going to read the whole affidavit, but I will link and archive it in the description of this video, but we will take a look at this paragraph here. Now, for background, Cook and Frost are the evil white supremacists who were arrested and convicted for plotting to attack American infrastructure. I know it's a little vague, but this is as close as we get to an explanation as to how they got caught. If somebody has a link to more information on this, I'd be very interested, but as of right now, this is the best I can find. It reads, Cook and Frost continued undeterred and eventually traveled to Texas together in March 2020. In the meantime, Cook had continued his recruitment efforts, primarily of juveniles, several of whom also lived in Texas. When Frost decided to return home for spring break in March 2020, Cook joined him for the drive with the intention of living with some of the contacts he had made there, and continuing their plans for an attack. On the drive south, Cook and Frost made plans to meet a recruit in Oklahoma, but the individual lost their phone and couldn't be reached for the meet. Instead, the person who found the phone and Nazi propaganda on it answered their calls and told them the phone would be turned into police, which caused Frost and Cook to start destroying their online communication accounts.
That is without a doubt the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
The FBI seriously wants us to believe that's the way that occurred? Who were they trying to recruit, Mr. Magoo? So let's work back the logistics of this for a minute. So the way the FBI is claiming they found out about this terror plot is these guys are trying to recruit somebody, and that recruit lost their phone. Said recruit has apparently no other alternate means to connect with these guys, even though they supposedly connected over the internet to begin with. And whoever found the phone was not only, for some reason, inclined to get into said phone, which is weird to me because I've found people's phones before and never once did I try to open their phone and see what was inside. And this person is able to get in the phone. It's apparently not locked, or they opened the phone with a password. And they search the phone in such detail that they find a ton of Nazi propaganda, which they then immediately realize is Nazi propaganda somehow, and are then inclined to turn them into the police. And mind you, the affidavit makes no mention of evidence on the phone that there was a concrete terror plot, like an imminent attack that would cause a reasonable person to turn that phone into the police. Most people, because it's not illegal to hold radical political opinions yet, would take a look at Nazi propaganda and be like, huh, this guy's kind of a weirdo. Okay, not turn them into the police. Not only are they inclined to turn them into the police, but they answer these guys' calls and tell them he's turning them into the police. Boy, the FBI agents on that case should go buy a lottery ticket or something. So, for those of you who can't read between the lines, this is obviously a sting operation. And I don't even understand why they would lie about this. It doesn't make any sense. Like, who would be upset that the FBI conducted a sting operation? Yeah, guys like me on the fringes of the internet will make the point that the FBI clearly couldn't find any organic white supremacist terrorism, so they had to target vulnerable individuals and make their own white supremacist terror. But because the right is getting their asses kicked so hard in the cyber war, that fact isn't gonna matter. It's not like the normies will ever hear about it. Even if they did, they wouldn't care. But the point of all this being, if this was a sting operation, it's not necessarily proof positive that there's some sort of epidemic of domestic right-wing terror in the United States. And certainly not evidence that the power grid attacks in the United States recently were perpetrated by right-wing or white supremacist actors. I mean, I'm open to the possibility that it was, in fact, perpetrated by some sort of grassroots right-wing movement, especially like any political organization. The right wing has its fair share of schizos who would do this sort of thing, and that's part of the reason why I'm making this video. But one of the things that I know about the conservative movement or the dissident right movement is that they're weak and can't be persuaded to pursue legal political change, let alone commit acts of terror. So if there was a right-wing terror plot and the FBI isn't already aware and doesn't already have people in custody, because it seems the only way that right-wingers will do this sort of thing is through encouragement by federal agents, I'm skeptical that it was a right-wing terror plot at all. Now, me pointing out inconsistencies like this and hypocrisy on the left is good entertainment for people like you and I. We're the sort of people who can reason critically and will think it's funny that the FBI wants us to believe that the dissident right, which we know to be comprised of complete and utter cowards who are unwilling to take any concrete action to save themselves, have gone from sporadic protests attended by like 3 or 4 people to outright domestic terrorism in a matter of weeks. And it is sort of comical. Like, do they think that these radical right-wing extremists are sitting there after having gone from peaceful protest to active terrorism in like 3 hours flat, saying to themselves,
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
It jumped up a notch.
It did, didn't it?
People with large followings, both in the traditional and alternative media, speculating that this attack was perpetrated by evil right-wing white terrorists based on nothing but half-baked conjecture alone is irresponsible, if you care at all for getting to the truth of things like this. But that's just it. These people aren't interested in the truth. There seems to be this conception on the right that the left is just like us. The left believes what they say, and truly, we all just want the same things, right? We all declare for liberty. We just have some different ideas as to how to get there. And so they try to reason with these people, and they try and point out hypocrisy and inconsistencies in their logic. And when they do, they think it's a big own. They think they've owned the libs, and that'll show them, and that'll convert them to our side. This is one of the largest failings of the right. The modern conservative is akin to the knights of yore during the twilight of their prominence. They'll gallop around on the tournament field, their armor shining and gleaming in the sun, not understanding that their way of thinking, their way of fighting, has passed. They pay no mind to those musketeers over there who are soon to supplant them.
Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Conservatives fail to understand that they're living in a failed state. Demographic replacement has so fucked this country that no longer are we a country at all. We don't have a sense of extended kinship with our neighbors and fellow citizens like we used to. We don't have any shared characteristics with them. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The United States at this point in time is nothing more than an arbitrarily set of drawn borders, an exclusive economic zone, populated not by citizens who feel a sense of extended kinship, but by consumers. And because there's no such thing as dual loyalty, because people are tribal by nature, we're in the midst of suffering the same fate as every multicultural empire in history. No longer can we truly view politics in this day and age through the prism of things like limited versus big government, or an agrarian versus an industrial society. What the conservative fails to understand is that this new dichotomy between left versus right is no longer about ideology, not truly. Because our government is no longer a government of, by, and for the people, but a government of a plutocratic elite who don't give a damn about people like you and I, an elite that's so insulated from the consequences of their poor governance that they don't suffer the same day-to-day hardships as people like you and I when their policies fail, because that same government, through a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to not only reduce us under absolute despotism, but to demographically replace us with a more docile population. The dynamics of the politics in the United States and the West have shifted. There's not a left versus right per se. There's not an establishment versus little people dichotomy. It's boiled down to, no matter how much we on the right hate it, not left versus right, but white versus non-white. And when you understand this, the actions of the left start to make more sense. It's never been about truth. It's never been about equality. It's never been about justice. It's about the demonization of white people, the undermining of the West, and cultural Marxism generally. for the benefit of the powers that be. And perhaps the greatest piece of evidence I have to that effect is the composition of the left and the composition of the right. Who comprises the left? It's this odd confederation of people who, in any other circumstance or context, would be diametrically opposed to one another. The classic example I use is the Democrats are the party of transvestites and radical Islamic groups. Or the converse of that is there are groups out there, for instance, Hispanic Catholics, who by all rights should probably be voting right-wing. I mean, they're pretty socially conservative, yet they consistently vote Democrat. And again, people on the right, who always seem to fail to understand the nature of the conflict in which they are engaged, don't understand this, and so they're perfectly okay with importing hordes of third world immigrants because they're ostensibly on their side, at least socially. But to circle back from this to the concept of fourth generation warfare and the attacks on the power grid, this phenomenon, these disparate groups forming an impromptu alliance to attack, undermine, and simply deal with the much larger threat of white people, is one of the defining characteristics of a fourth generation conflict. And again, make no mistake, we are engaged in a fourth generation conflict, especially when you consider, like we're about to examine, who benefits from all this? Who benefits from an attack on critical infrastructure in the United States?
What is the best way to solve a crime? Sometimes it is just two words. Cui bono.
Let's take a look at the immediate effects of this attack on our critical power infrastructure. We'll start with the positive outcomes for the dissident right, supposedly the ones who are perpetrating these attacks. And as we do so, let's bear in mind this really simple and rudimentary equation to calculate whether or not your adversary is going to lose a war. And that is the ability of any force or group to fight is equal to the means they have at their disposal to fight multiplied by their will to fight. When either their means or their will falls to zero, so too does their ability to fight. So let's examine, as adherents of the concept of fourth generation warfare and practitioners of maneuver war, how the act of attacking critical infrastructure has affected the means and the will of our adversaries to fight. So the most direct and first level effect of attacking a piece of critical infrastructure is power was knocked out for a relatively short period of time in a relatively small area of the United States. Did this affect the means of our adversaries to fight? I suppose, but not in any meaningful way. If there was a decline, it was virtually imperceptible. And it's now undeniable that in the future, security of power stations and other pieces of critical infrastructure like this will be heightened, making it more difficult to ever do anything like this again, if that's your aim. Moreover, an attack like this just justifies more tyrannical behavior on behalf of the government and the powers that be. True, this attack more or less affected people in the same way that a regular power outage would affect them, but the government reacted very differently. As a direct result of this attack, curfews were imposed. There was effectively a sort of martial law imposed, and there were novel forms of bureaucratic tyranny. For instance, in North Carolina, restaurants affected by the power outage had to prove that they got power back before they were allowed by local governments to reopen their doors. Now, every region suffers power outages from time to time, and it's highly irregular, if not completely unheard of, that a restaurant would have to prove to a local government entity that they got power back before they're allowed to reopen their doors. This seems aimed directly at undermining local support in the affected regions, if there was any to begin with, for the perpetrators of this act of domestic terror, if it actually was in fact an act of domestic terror, as is being portrayed by the media. Though we'll touch on the aspect of will to fight and support of the people in a second. So, by my reckoning, congratulations, domestic terrorists. You've played yourself. for a limited, imperceptible gain in your favor of the ability of your enemy to fight, they've now, long-term, increased their ability to fight you by adding new tools to their toolbox and setting new precedents in the event of attacks like this.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
So what of the will of your adversary to fight you? Do the locals now hate the government for being unable to protect them from you? Are drag queens now shaking in their fake tits, too afraid to come to your town? No. An attack like this, if it's real and not fake and gay, only serves to alienate you from your base of support, the people, the local population, whose support you need to succeed, and galvanize that population into action against you. In case you didn't notice, people tend to get a little upset when their shit doesn't work, especially when it has to do with their basic comfort. In case you didn't notice or don't remember, in the face of a terror attack, the modern average American is willing to give away virtually all of his liberties for a little bit of security. Don't believe me because you weren't alive when 9/11 happened? Well, go Google the Patriot Act for me, buddy. And because the right, people like us, fail to recognize the importance of the novel virtual battle space and have almost completely ceded control of it to our adversaries who want you dead and think it's funny, who don't care about truth or justice or individual liberty. The moment an attack like this happens, or it even looks like an attack has happened, you will have every talking head in the traditional media, every TikToker, every YouTuber, every Reddit account blaming not just radical or fringe elements, but the rank and file, people like you and I, for their eroding what little support you have in the minds of the people. And furthermore, it doesn't even matter if it actually was an attack, or it actually happened the way they said it happened, because, again, they're uncontested on this new virtual battlefield. And unless they've said something egregiously false or egregiously wrong, they're never going to be forced to issue a retraction. And even if they did, most people never see a retraction or a quiet update to a news story. Hell, most people never even read beyond the headline. So you can even have just a really misleading headline. And it doesn't matter if it's real or not, it matters that it was real in their minds.
They are real to me!
So even if you're some retard who's actually agitating for a Civil War Part 2 electric boogaloo, which I won't go into too much detail here because I've made a rather lengthy video on it already, which will be linked in the description, attacks like this, again, if they're not some sort of false flag, are stupid. Why in the hell would you, a gorilla, whose center of gravity, and critical vulnerability for that matter, is the support of the people, then turn around and directly attack the people? Let me put it even more clearly. On the off chance that this is real, and it was somebody from my side of the aisle, stop. Do not do this. You are not helping. You are hurting. Morality aside, this is not the way to do things. This is not pragmatic. This only hurts us long term and makes it more likely that we're not going to come out of this on top.
You need to stop everything. This needs to stop now. This is not okay. This needs to stop now. This is cancer.
I can already see the comment section now. Jim, you're such a defeatist. Or, Fed shill, haha, glowy. Or, what's your solution, coward? Okay, I'll give you my solution. This is my call to arms. I need your help. I can't do this alone. If we're going to succeed as a community, here's what I need from you.
It's your credit card number, the 3 digits on the back, and the expiration month and year.
No, but in all seriousness, do you want to know why I'm Jim Dewey with combating the narrative instead of just plain old Jim Dewey or revising the narrative or something to that effect. It's in recognition that what I'm doing is fighting a war in a novel battle space. It's kind of boring, not particularly glamorous, and much more difficult than what the average conservative or average member of the dissident right wants to do. The average conservative wants to talk about the prospect of a civil war as they lose battle after battle after battle in the political sphere and in cyberspace. He wants to arm himself for a kinetic conflict. He lives in the days of the last war and thinks political salvation will come at the muzzle of his AR-15. I'm not going to rehash my last video on this subject, but suffice to say, not so. If we came out on top, if it came to war, the victory would likely be Pyrrhic. The juice isn't worth the squeeze in that regard. Men like us would likely die. And I'd like to remind you that
no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country.
I need your help winning the hearts and minds of the population. I need your help fighting in this new virtual battle space, especially because at this point in time, we're fighting uphill against a lot of institutional power and censorship because we've ceded and backpedaled and retreated in this battle space for years. Stop saying, it's just TikTok, who cares? Or it's just Rachel Maddow, or it's just Instagram or YouTube or some shitpost on Twitter. Meme war is real, and people who would otherwise be on our side have their minds melted by this shit. Don't believe me? Well then, I'd ask you to examine how you came to be on the side of the dissident right. I would suspect that your conversion probably started with some sort of online information. He who controls that controls the hearts and minds of the people and the future. So I need you to stop waiting for some opportunity to pick up your rifle and effect meaningful political change. No, pick up your keyboard and follow me. Create pro-white content. Attack anti-white narratives, anti-Western narratives, anti-traditional narratives, particularly on TikTok, because that's where the newer generation is. That's where the battle for Generation Z is being fought, and that's where we're losing. Yeah, you're probably going to get your videos taken down and your account banned, but take a page from the left. Just create new accounts and keep on keeping on. Or if you can't waste the time to do that, shit up comment sections. Tweet at people. Do something. Do not let anti-white hate and anti-white content go unchallenged. Even if you're just challenging it in the comments section. Provide people with a new perspective that they may not have seen or heard before. Also, amplify the voices of your comrades on the dissident right. Hitting a retweet button or a like button or reposting or re-uploading content goes a long way and takes minimal effort. And for the love of God, please don't punch right. Yes, I understand that we have significant disagreements amongst ourselves, and they're not insignificant or petty in their own right, but they are insignificant and petty compared to the existential threat that we face here in the West. Stop worrying about the guy who agrees with you 90% of the way, and start worrying about the hordes of migrants pouring over our border, or the people who want degenerate kitty diddlers to strip dance in front of kids. Worry about the people who want you dead and think it's funny. And one key factor in doing this is understanding that the powers aligned against you are a loose, ad hoc collection of people who are diametrically opposed to one another. This alliance that they have is temporary, and the purpose is to attack a larger threat, the white Westerner. Highlight white hatred and call them out on it. Don't waste a ton of time pointing out hypocrisy. Like I said earlier, it's not going to do much for us. They don't care about truth or hypocrisy in that sense. They care about undermining and subverting you and our civilization. Try not to engage with all the sophistry and bullshit. Cut through it all and try and get right to the heart, right to the crux of the issue. But this, in and of itself, isn't enough. It won't affect meaningful change alone. It's one part of a two-pronged offensive. We have to follow up with real-world, concrete action. The first piece of this is taking a page from the book of our adversaries, what they've been doing for nigh on a century at this point. Organize in person. Don't get violent. Decry violence at every opportunity. But we have to follow up in person. We have to protest. We have to get visibility. We have to seize opportunities and take to the streets whenever possible. Many are afraid of doing this because they're afraid of infiltration from members of the federal government, and their fears aren't necessarily unfounded. From time to time, it does happen. However, understand that not everyone is a Fed. Not everyone can possibly be a Fed. And even if they were, don't do anything illegal and not much harm can come to you. What's the worst that can happen? You get outed to your employer and they terminate you? Is life so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of your 9 to 5? You're willing to die in some hypothetical civil war that exists in your mind, but you're not willing to face minor consequences in your personal life? And yeah, I will cede the point that in protesting, you do risk being arrested, but as long as you're not doing something heinous or really criminal, what are they going to hit you with? Disorderly conduct? Protesting without a permit? Number one, realize that victors write the history books, and if we come out on top, you'll be a hero. If we don't, you're going to be a villain anyway. And if the powers that be can make Nelson Mandela, the guy who blew up school bus loads of children, look like a hero in retrospect, then you'll be okay. And if you do find yourself in legal trouble, we as a community need to get together and crowdfund legal defense, just like the left has been doing for years at this point. And yeah, true, we may run into issues with websites like GoFundMe taking our campaigns down, or payment processors refusing to serve us, or whatever, but there are ways around that. We can't let hypothetical threats paralyze us into inaction, paralyze us into allowing our enemies to run roughshod over us. But in organizing, we have to be mindful of the fact that the eyes of the world are upon us, and they're not going to be charitable. We have to police our own and do our best to prevent something like the bad optics of Charlottesville from happening again. Don't look cultish. Don't try to look tactical or intimidating. The tiki torches chanting, "Hebes will not replace us," or whatever it was, bad idea. Bad optics. They're going to try to make you look crazy or look like a cult, and that just gives them ammunition. Unless there is some sort of credible threat, like there was during the BLM riots, don't show up in tactical gear. They want to paint you as domestic terrorists. Don't prove them right. And in those instances where violence may occur, it's in your best interest to disengage as soon as possible, because you're going to get the James Fields or Kyle Rittenhouse treatment if you get involved in something like that. If you feel you may be in danger, well, then concealed carry where allowed, or something like that. Or wear soft body armor under your regular clothes. But don't try to look like RoboCop. Humanize yourself. You want people to be able to identify with you. Show your face. Do away with the scary-looking rifles. Do away with the dark sunglasses and Kevlar helmets. Try to look like a regular, reasonable person with whom these people can identify. And no Nazi or Confederate symbols, please. Like, it doesn't help. It doesn't help at all. Yeah, I can sympathize with the Confederacy, for instance, but, I mean, in the minds of most people, the Confederate flag is just a symbol for double plus bad, wrong think, and is immediately going to turn people off. Doubly so with, like, swastikas, so do not do that. Endeavor to look clean cut and professional. Don't yell, don't scream, don't try to look angry. Don't look or act slovenly. Wash your penis, bucko.
Did you know that if you don't wash your penis the right way every single day, that you could possibly get cancer?
The other piece of concrete real-life action that we need to take is trying to get ourselves or retake some of the institutional power we once had. If you're waiting for some president to get elected and fix everything from the top down, you're going to be waiting forever because it's never going to happen. Furthermore, state and local governments have more of an impact on your day-to-day life and your community than the federal government does at this point. The solution here is to run for local public offices, people like you and I, and try to affect political change that way. Do things like pass legislation that makes it really, really difficult for illegal immigrants to live in your community, or ban anti-white propaganda in classrooms, or end affirmative action at various levels. Create Second Amendment sanctuaries and dare state and federal governments to take action against you. Do your best to cancel your political adversaries where you're able. For instance, don't allow people to hold minor public offices or positions like teacher who hold these radical anti-white views. Make it known and agitate for their termination. And who knows, maybe one or two of us come to prominence for actions in our local communities and rise to political offices at a higher level. Yeah, politics right now, especially on the state and national levels, are pretty fake and gay, and the idea of a party dichotomy is stupid, but it wasn't always that way, and it doesn't always have to be that way. Even if it is, we just accumulate enough political power in a block of states to agitate for something like a national divorce and go our own way. These things will seem impossible until they're not, and every journey, every endeavor begins with a single step. In summation, understand that the term asymmetric warfare is not synonymous with guerrilla warfare. The asymmetry in asymmetric means for you to pit your strength against your enemy's weakness and not engage your enemy where he is strong. Now, this may seem like a basic precept, but this seems to be ignored by conservatives who would rather sit and wait for a civil war which will never come. And if it did, they'd be fighting their enemies where they're strong, instead of taking concrete action today, attempting to fight their enemies where they're weakest, and engage the enemy in the cyber domain to try and win the hearts and minds of the people. An attack, like an attack on the power grid, is counterproductive. It's not going to do anything to help our cause. With that, I'm Jim Dewey, and this has been Combating the Narrative.
Please clap.
Now, if you've watched through the entirety of this 50-some-odd minute video, chances are you enjoyed the content. So go ahead and leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for similar content. If you hated the video, I can't tell you how much I enjoy watching you seethe in the comments section, so please drop a couple of comments and a dislike below too. At any rate, the engagement helps the channel, so that's it. See ya.